You were at dinner last week, or a barbecue, or some work thing you didn't really want to go to, and you sat there in the middle of the conversation, and something quietly switched off. Not because you were tired, not because you don't like people, but because the conversation hit a certain depth and just stopped. Like a road that ends at a field. Everyone else seemed fine with it. They kept talking. You kept nodding. And somewhere underneath all of that, something in you was doing what it always does, watching. Measuring the distance between where the conversation was and where it could have gone. You've been doing that your whole life. And if you've ever walked away from a room full of people feeling more alone than when you walked in, this is the video that explains why. Not as a flaw, not as something to fix, as something that finally makes sense. There's a specific kind of loneliness that doesn't get talked about much. Not the loneliness of isolation, not the kind that comes from losing someone or from moving somewhere new where you don't know anybody. This one is quieter than that, and in some ways, harder to explain, because it shows up most in the middle of company. You're there. You're present. You can hold a conversation. You can laugh at the right moments. You can read the room well enough. But there's a part of you running underneath all of it that isn't really connecting, because the depth you're looking for, that particular register of conversation that actually engages the part of your mind that matters, isn't there. And the strange part is, the people around you have no idea. Because from the outside, you look fine. You look like a man at a barbecue, eating a burger. For Gen X men now in their mid-40s to early 60s, this experience tends to be old and familiar. You can trace it back. The classroom where the pace was never fast enough. The friendships that felt genuine but skimmed the surface. The way you got used to processing most of what you were thinking privately, because bringing it into a room usually created friction you weren't interested in managing. What you probably didn't know is that what you've been living has a psychological explanation, a real one, and it changes the way the whole thing looks. Because the reason it happens isn't about personality, it's about wiring. And once you understand the wiring, the loneliness stops feeling like something wrong with you. In 2016, researchers Norman Lai and Satoshi Kanazawa published a study in the British Journal of Psychology. It covered over 15,000 adults and looked at what actually predicts life satisfaction. One of the findings landed differently from the rest. For most people, more frequent social contact meant higher reported well-being. That's the expected result. But for people with higher intelligence, the pattern reversed. More frequent socializing was associated with lower life satisfaction, not higher. The explanation they landed on wasn't that smart people dislike others. It was that the internal cognitive environment, the richness of what's already happening inside the mind, provides enough engagement that external stimulation becomes less necessary. And when the external stimulation on offer is shallow, it doesn't just fail to help, it actively creates friction. Here's what that means practically. When you're in a conversation that doesn't go anywhere, you're not just bored in the ordinary sense. Your brain is running at a register the conversation isn't meeting. And the gap between those two things has a texture. It has a particular quality of effort. The effort of staying present in an environment that keeps running out of road. You've felt that, probably more times than you can count. There's a second layer to this. Research on what psychologists call the introvert advantage, studied extensively by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi at the University of Chicago, found that people who score high on both intelligence and introversion reach what he called flow states more readily in solitary, complex activity than in social settings. The mind that functions best on its own doesn't do that out of damage. It does it because that's where it actually works. For a Gen X man in his 50s, this has been compounding for decades. You figured out early that your thinking gets clearer when the noise drops. That the best conversations you've had in your life, the ones you still remember, were with one person, not 12. That a quiet evening with something worth reading does something that a crowded room almost never does. That's not antisocial. That's architecture. And it's been yours your whole life. But understanding why it happens is only half of it, because there's a reframe here that most people never reach, and it changes the meaning of the whole thing. Here's the thing about loneliness. The story most people carry about it is that it means something is missing, a deficit, evidence of a gap between who you are and how you should be. For most people, that story is worth examining. But for this particular experience, the loneliness of a mind that processes at a different register, that story is just wrong. What you've been calling loneliness is mostly the cost of having an interior life that doesn't need a crowd to sustain it. The conversations that run out of road aren't running out of road because you're difficult to talk to. They're running out of road because you got there faster than the conversation did. That's not rejection. That's just how your mind moves. The men who carry this well, and you've probably met one or two of them, aren't men who found the cure for the feeling. They're men who stopped interpreting the feeling as evidence against themselves. They let it be what it is: information. A signal that says this environment isn't the one, not that no environment ever will be. At this stage of life, and this matters, because there's something specific that happens in your 50s. The capacity to live without the approval of the room gets stronger. The performance that younger men feel obligated to put on, the effort to seem more available, more agreeable, more easy to read than you actually are, that starts to fall away. Not because you've given up, because you finally run out of patience for pretending the cost is worth it. That's not isolation. That's clarity. And there's a real difference, which brings us to what this actually means for where you are right now. Because there's something you can do with this that most men never think to do. The question worth sitting with isn't how to feel less lonely in rooms that were never going to engage you. It's whether you've built, or started building, the conditions where your mind actually works, the conversations that have depth, the one or two people who can go somewhere with you in a discussion and don't need you to come back, the work, the project, the thing you're actually thinking about, given the room it needs. Because here's what's true about Gen X men at this stage. You have something that men in their 30s are still trying to accumulate. You have the accumulated architecture of a life spent thinking. 4 decades of reading, noticing, connecting things other people walked past. That doesn't depreciate with age. It compounds. The loneliness you've carried, the particular texture of it, the feeling of operating on a frequency the room can't quite tune into. That's the same thing as depth. You don't get one without the other. Men who process at a different register have always had fewer people to really talk to. That's not going to change. But the ones who are living well at 55 and 60 aren't the ones who found a way around that fact. They're the ones who stopped spending energy resisting it and started spending it on the things the quiet makes possible. You've had more practice at being with yourself than almost anyone you know. That's not a consolation. That's a genuine advantage. And at this point in your life, it's worth using it like one. If any of this landed, if you've spent years in rooms feeling like the conversation stopped somewhere you hadn't, then you already knew most of this. You just didn't have the language for it yet. Now, you do. If this channel is speaking to something real for you, subscribe. There's more coming that's built specifically for where you are right now. And if you haven't watched the last video, The one about how 80s cult classics shaped Gen X men in ways nobody fully clocked at the time, it connects directly to this. Those films weren't just entertainment. They were the first place a lot of Gen X men saw themselves reflected. The outsider, the one who didn't quite fit the available mold. The loneliness we talked about today was already there on screen. You just didn't have the psychology to name it yet. That video is worth your time. You've been thinking your own way through the world for a long time. That's not the problem. That's the whole point.